Expedition 44, here again with Matt and Ryan. We have been going through the book of Job, and we are getting down to the fun parts now. We're in the last three chapters, 40, 41, 42, and this is where the pieces of the puzzle kind of start to come together and fit. Where have we been up to here, Matt?
So we've gone through basically the three cycles of discourses with Job and his friends, and then the young guy, Elihu, comes. After that, Job kind of demands a meeting with God. So God comes in a whirlwind and basically takes Job on a tour of the universe and shows him all the intricacies of God's creation. And it's like, Job, can you run this for even a day?
Yeah, and we're still kind of struggling with where we draw the lines of literary and not literary. Mm-hmm. Like, can we just demand meetings with God and God will have that? I mean, we have prayers, so we're constantly talking to Him, but at the same time, this doesn't really seem to kind of take the form that I think God would honor of us demanding meetings with Him. So we're still kind of going back and forth of what are we gleaning from this and what can we pull? So we continue to do that this week as we look through this, but we arrive at verse 40, and the thing that God kind of starts out saying is kind of brace yourself, like man up. We're getting ready to like get to the bottom of this thing, and a lot of people kind of feel like God never really answers the question here. Like, you know, God kind of leaves this book in a cliffhanger, yet you and I kind of see that differently.
Yeah, we think that He actually does answer Job's question, but most people get stuck on reading the Bible as not a literary device, but at face value. So they think that God is teaching science and zoology here in chapters the 40 and 41.
And I've almost heard people like write this off because like they don't know how to explain it. They're like stuck in this Behemoth, Leviathan, like mythology thing, and it's like, you know, you and I are going, you're totally missing the point.
Yes, God's using these two creatures, whether they were actual animals or extinct now or mythological. I go more toward the mythological side. But He uses them as basically to set up His answer. Yeah.
So we've seen at the beginning of the book, Job is very righteous, and then kind of throughout these speeches and everything else, we kind of see him break down a little bit. And by the time we get to here, we almost see frustration, I think, from both sides of the fence, and kind of like this all right, let's have a serious conversation, and this is where it ends. And so 40 kind of opens up this conversation with getting down to it. And so we kind of see a couple things going back and forth here, but Job is still kind of stuck on the retribution principle going into this.
He is.
And this is where God just says no. And we kind of see the last speech from the younger Elihu, and he kind of gets it right. Like, he kind of says, you know, maybe you're a little self-righteous. And actually in 40, there's some things that God says that like kind of affirm that he was self-righteous. But we also know that Elihu wasn't completely right in his assessment, that he was his foundation was flawed, that he was still kind of going back to that retribution principle. And so this is really, I love how this book challenges your mind. In fact, when you first start reading chapter 1 and 2, and your mind is going, could God operate like this? And that's kind of where Job's mind is trying to figure out with his friends how God operates. And by the time you get to the book, it's fascinating because where your mind is kind of puts you in the mindset of Job when you're asking those questions. And that's why it's a literary device in my mind. It's beautifully done because you start reading this and you're asking the same questions that Job and his friends are answering. And when you get to the end, you kind of go, boy, all these things I've been questioning in this book really don't matter. They're not really the question. The question is, do I trust this relational God to be the author and perfecter of my life and of the world and His creation and everything else? And who am I to even begin to question something like that? So let's jump into it. You kind of mentioned the sea creatures. What are these creatures?
All right, so we have Behemoth and Leviathan, which are the two creatures that God talks about in chapters 40 and 41. So Behemoth, he is basically a land creature. They refer to this as sometimes in the ancient world. You have some texts in the Babylonian literature, Ugaritic, that these were chaos monsters. And we might get into that in a little bit here. But Leviathan was the sea creature, and Behemoth is the land dwelling, kind of also hangs out in rivers and stuff like that. You kind of see, but it's 4 legs upright. The other one seems more like fish-like or dragon-like, but dwelling in the water.
They're pretty cool.
They're pretty cool.
My kids love this part. Dad, let's read those sea creatures. And you know, you can look at this and start kind of challenging this and say, did these ever exist, like you implied? And when it gets down to it, like, those aren't really the right questions to ask. It doesn't really matter.
No. So the Bible is written in a context that isn't our context.
Yeah.
So these would have been, based on what we know from ancient literature, things that would have been prominent in their thoughts.
Yeah.
So definitely. They would have referred to these as kind of the biggest and most glorious creatures, but dangerous in both the land and the water.
Kind of goes back to why Job. Job is seen as the most righteous man who probably ever walked the planet, and that's why the book is about him. If there's another righteous man, it would have been written about him.
Yep.
Same thing goes with these animals. Like, if there was another bigger, badder land or sea creature, God would have written about those.
Yep.
But we get them because he's doing that. And did they exist? You kind of get into some of these Ugaritic texts, as Matt mentioned, and there's stories about them, but we just don't know if that's true. Like, one of them says there's a male and female created, and God goes to war and destroys one of them, and that's kind of why they're not there. But I don't want to get caught up in any of the mythology or any of that kind of stuff.
And Psalm 74 kind of alludes to, like, Leviathan having 7 heads and breathing fire, and we don't have anything kind of like that now. We haven't really found anything through archaeology either.
And it might not have ever existed.
It might not have.
I mean, it's there. We see composite creatures in the Bible a lot of times where we understand part of it, and they've kind of been fit together like a little kid taking Legos apart and reassembling them. And some people actually even look at the cherubim that way. That they could be representations of that. So again, we just don't know. And a lot of Job is, as we keep saying, literary device. And so to kind of what a lot of people do with this is they try to make this out to be what they want it to be.
Yeah.
Like you said with science a lot of times. And we can't do that. We can't take this book and mold it and say, oh, this is what we want it to be. We have to, and this is a huge message of Job, is we have to accept what God has given us.
Yep.
And so it all fits together again. Like, the literary genre of it is amazing how it works on your mind from so many different angles, communicating the same thought through different devices. That way. All right, so we've got these chaos monsters, and they don't seem to be naturally evil or enemies of God, but they can cause damage amongst God's creation. How you kind of mentioned the culture would have understood this from the mythology and places they were mentioned before. Where do we put them?
So in the ancient world, gods created order in the world, and so these kind of creatures are kind of on the peripheral. They're dangerous things that could kind of wreak havoc in creation, but they weren't necessarily bad. So they kind of had one foot in the realm of order and one foot in the realm of disorder, but could bring that disorder realm into the realm of order.
Yep. And you would have thought, living back then, that there were several gods, whether you fall into fallen deities or however you view those, but the gods would use these type of animals to kind of do their deeds. People would think that they had them on a leash, and later when we start reading some of this stuff, it alludes to that several times through the text.
And even like Behemoth is sometimes depicted in ancient literature as the god El's ox. So what he rode, basically.
Like, are the gods keeping them under guard, so to speak? It's there's a lot of good stuff in there, and even in Genesis, we'll kind of get to this later, but there's actually some pictures of that throughout there as well. So this is the way the ancient world was thinking of it, and it's no different in the book of Job. That's how people would have been reading this at the same time. And so let's talk about the first one, the Behemoth. What do we know about him? Where do we put him? Where does the text go with this character?
All right, so if we look at Job 40, verse 15, we see that God starts by describing Behemoth, and he compares Job to him. He puts them in the same category. So right off the bat, we got to see, all right, if the author of Job is using this as a literary device, he's comparing Job to Behemoth. So right from the beginning, he said that Behemoth is content and well-fed, as Job was also content and well-fed. He made Job strong. Job is the most righteous person, so there's the comparison there. He ranks first among his kind. Like we said, Job, if there was a more righteous person, the book of Job would have been about that person and not about Job. He's cared for. We saw all of the blessings that God gave him. He was sheltered, protected. But then in verse 23, it kind of turns to how Job should be behaving.
Right.
So we see that Behemoth is not alarmed by the raging river, as Job shouldn't be alarmed about his situation.
And what's interesting is earlier in the text, Job kind of alludes that God is treating him like a behemoth. So there's kind of a play coming back to this, like God is kind of answering this question.
He's treating him like a chaos creature, and God's saying, well, maybe you should be more like one. So it says the Behemoth is, in verse 23, he trusts and is secure, as Job should be. He cannot be captured or trapped, so basically Job shouldn't be so vulnerable. So that's kind of where we get with God comparing Behemoth to Job and what God did for him, and also the position and the posture that Job should be taking in his situation right now.
One of my favorite is 40:23, where it says, "If a river rages, he is not alarmed." And it just kind of, it's like a wake-up call.
Yeah.
It's like this whole thing, your life is turbulent, you're in the middle of this, but it's saying you shouldn't be alarmed.
Yeah.
Like God is in control, and give him that trust.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty neat. And you could read this whole thing, and all of these are kind of plays on the entire story of what Job is thinking or how he was thinking, and God kind of correcting of how he should be thinking.
Yep.
And then we go into the next one, and this is a Leviathan. Tell us a little bit more about Leviathan.
Okay, so in Leviathan, when we get to chapter 41, it switches immediately to you. So it focuses in on what Job can't do to Leviathan.
Yeah.
So he says that in verse 1 and 2 that you can't control Leviathan. So what Yahweh's doing here in this speech is saying that if you can't do these things to this chaos monster, then you definitely can't do them to me, because I'm even more powerful. Yep. So
now some people would actually say that these creatures could like represent the challenger or something like that, or they kind of take them back to like the retribution principle of like, this is justice.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you put stuff like that?
You can't.
It's really not in the scripture. I mean, I don't get that at all when I hear. I mean, there's some pretty big commentators where you read them taking it back to that, and I look at this and I go, how did you come up with that? I don't see it.
And you don't see it going forward.
So what is Leviathan? Like, what is the representation?
Well, it's the most powerful creature of the sea.
Yeah. So if this is the most powerful thing of the sea, is God saying like, he's equal to the Leviathan, he is the Leviathan?
He's saying he's bigger and more powerful than Leviathan. Yeah. So yeah, if you can't do this to Leviathan, you can't do it to me. Exactly. So you need to change the way you're thinking.
So what are some of these descriptions then? Let's kind of go through them and look at them, and we'll kind of talk about some of them. And it's still literary. It's going back and forth and kind of talking about the actual chaos creature and the descriptions of those things, but at the same time, it's making allusions as to God and Job and the relationship between them.
Yeah, it's saying basically in verse 1 and 2, you can't control Leviathan, so you can't. Yahweh also, he can't control God.
Yeah. Yep. And it was that play on the leash, the God's on the leash thing of like, is Job trying to put God on a leash here?
Yeah, verse 3 to 6, it won't submit to you and it won't beg for mercy.
Yeah.
It's like you can't put a hook in its jaw, you can't put a rope through its nose.
Keeps going back to who are you to try to play God or to harness God?
Yeah, it can't be wounded. It's hopeless to struggle against him. That's verses 7 to 9.
And these are all things that God is communicating to us. I mean, when we're going through these struggles, it's saying, kind of putting us in our place. And that was the man up, let me tell you, how this is. And again, when you're just reading these as, did these monsters actually exist? I mean, what is this saying and all that stuff? You're missing the point. Like the point is these words of describing how God works in the same way as the animal, and saying, now not only are you struggling with this creation of mine, but how much more so would you struggle with me in these areas?
Yeah, I really like 12 to 18, where it kind of talks about trying to domesticate Leviathan.
Yeah. So how often do we try to do that with God?
Yeah, put God in a box.
Yep. We're going to make, I hate to say it, but we do that. Churches do that. I mean, it's like we've kind of created this Americanized, westernized thing of what we think God and church should be. And sometimes you and I look at it and go, wow, are we missing the mark here?
Yep. Yeah, and it's also saying that God, if you keep going down 26 to 32, God isn't vulnerable.
Yeah. So we have this, the Behemoth is not righteous and the Leviathan is not just, and it kind of says these things like we've been grappling with all of his friends, and he just throws it out there and says we're not going there, we're not having that conversation. Sort of can't be moved, can't be challenged. Those words of just saying, I am God and who are you to have these conversations with me.
And then he kind of concludes the whole speech saying that basically Leviathan dominates over all the proud.
So
those
are big words. Going back to a little bit of the truth to the self-righteousness part a little bit, and kind of putting Job in his place. I mean, this is, when you read it, you take this mindset, these are hard words. I mean, I can't imagine God getting almost angry with me having these words with me like that. I mean, it would definitely, the way I was thinking, it puts you, if you were Job, puts you in your place. And does Job get mad? Does he get angry? What's his response to this?
No, he basically says he repents.
I mean,
he kind of takes back. He's like, I wish I could take back everything I said. Almost. So
I mean, we haven't seen this in Job in the entire book.
No.
I mean, we've seen quite the opposite of it, and then all of a sudden, in just a few quick verses, we get this idea that he completely does a 180. I mean, it's and when you look at forgiveness in the Bible and true repentance, that's really what it means, is a complete turn.
Yep.
And a lot of these words that we are reading in this, it's that same idea, and we see that in the New Testament and the Old Testament over and over, but it's a complete, almost regret, a 180.
Yeah.
And again, this is amazing with this book, because the whole idea of the book, you think, is about the idea, does God give credit or blessings or material things to those that are righteous? It starts out putting you in that mindset, and one of the big questions of the book is, does God actually change his idea on that? And so as we're reading these ideas of regret, he shows a picture of this. Does God actually kind of do the same thing in the story and do a 180 of changing his ways? And we see this in other places in the scripture. Jonah in Genesis 6 and Exodus 32 and Jeremiah 4 and 18 kind of keeps going with
Genesis
that same
6.
thing. Joel 2, Jonah, the whole book kind of represents that. And so there is, when we're looking at the theology in Job, there is a whole part of this to understanding a dynamic relational God, and some people are really afraid to go there with this.
Yeah. Also, it kind of shows, like, when we address prayer, does prayer actually do anything?
Right. Why are we praying if it doesn't do anything?
Everything is lined up the way it is, and what's the purpose of prayer?
Yeah.
If God isn't dynamic.
And some people see this whole interaction like, are they actually saying these words, or is this more of a prayerful thought between Job and God? So is it essentially a large prayer? And part of this, as you can read, is how is God reacting to prayers to him?
Yeah. So I guess concluding Behemoth and Leviathan. So we're seeing here that God's telling Job via the picture of Behemoth to be strong and basically to stand firm and to trust God.
Yeah.
And through the picture of Leviathan, he's saying, you can't domesticate me, you shouldn't be trying to subdue me or put me in a box.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what we have.
And that's the whole message to the book. I mean, it's so complex, yet it's so simple at the same time.
Yeah.
And we struggle with that more than anything. I mean, so many people are trying to make God out to be something that the text doesn't tell us that he is. And God is saying, keep this pure, keep this simple, keep this nature of me to who I am.
Yeah, stay in a relationship with me, follow where I'm going to lead you, just trust what I'm doing.
Yeah. So we're still going back to these kind of blurred literary lines. Like, I've heard people say the entire book is literary device. I've heard other people say the entire book is literal. Like, you should read it exactly the way it is, and there were literal, these sea creatures actually existed exactly the way that they say, and, Job's friends and the conversations word for word were what happened. And we have the question, most people fall someplace in the middle there. Where do you draw this line?
Yeah, it's really hard to see what, obviously there's some brilliant literary poetry as we've talked about in this, and some of this is, I believe, it's been put together to shape the way that we approach the book. So I take it more of that, Job is literally an actual person that did exist, but some of these situations might not have fallen the exact way that they're explained. It's put there to communicate a truth. So whether it, like we've said, whether it was all of this is face value the way that it happened, or whether it's a literary device, it doesn't change the truthfulness of the book.
And people get so hung up on like the science of the monsters and all this stuff, and they almost miss the message. And it's important that we don't major on the minors, and that's one of the problems Matt and I have a lot of times with people going to some of the biblical things theologically, is in that doing so they get so caught up on these little things that they miss the major message of the text. And so one of the questions that leaves us saying is, what is literary? Are just the speeches of the guys literary? What about these speeches of God?
Yeah, it brings us to the question, would God really do this to me?
Yeah. And so we keep asking these questions, and we keep saying they're not really the right questions to ask, because in the end, whether you view the whole thing as literary, which actually might not be such a bad view, or the whole thing as literal or someplace in between, the major importance of it is that you're not getting hung up on those things, and you're taking in the message to the heart.
Yeah, and the message is trust God and all that he does.
Yeah, so simple, yet we struggle with it so much. May God bless you and keep you.